our session with Brian McLaren. Just a point for some technical issues or things that, so you know this. If you put your question into the feed and it disappears, know that that question has been put into queue for Brian to be able to respond to it. So we're so happy to have you with us here today. And Brian, thanks for being here. And to kick it off, Brian, can you let us know, how did you become associated with the CAC?
Yeah, well, I had heard of Richard maybe before I'd heard of the CAC, probably like a lot of people. But now, over 20 years ago, I think 22 years ago, a dear friend, Spencer Burke, started a conference called Solarize. And I remember when Spencer invited me to speak at this conference, it was held up in Seattle, Washington. He said, Father Richard Rohr is going to be there, and I really want to be sure you two get to meet. Spencer just said, I just feel like you two really need to meet. So he made sure at one of the lunches that we got to sit next to each other. And I'd grown up Protestant. You know, we just didn't, our worlds were, our universes were a lot more parallel universes back then. And, but I'd always had a deep interest in Catholicism since graduate school. I had done my thesis on a Catholic novelist named Walker Percy, and I'd been deeply involved with Flannery O'Connor as a writer. So I had all of these Catholic connections. A Catholic philosopher named Gabriel Marcel had interested me. And so I was eager to meet Richard. And then what happened over the next 10 years really is Richard would be invited to speak somewhere. I was invited to speak there, and we would make sure we got to have a meal together. And our friendship just grew episodically. Whenever I would have a chance to speak where Richard was, I would make sure that I could arrive to not just give my talk and leave, but to actually get to hear him. So it's been a good friendship and for many years. But one of our dinners stands out in particular. I believe we were in San Diego. This, I'm going to guess, was around 2006, 2007. And we're having dinner at a Mexican restaurant, and Richard says something like this. I say, what are you thinking about these days? And he said, well, I'm just thinking that a lot of the things you and I are trying to teach, people don't really get them. He said, because I think they haven't developed a kind of intellectual maturity and spiritual maturity to think in non-dual categories. That may have been one of the first times I heard that word used in those ways. And he said, I'm thinking that we need to spend more time helping people think in a new way, so then the things we're talking about will make a little bit more sense. I just have to say, at that dinner, I just thought, that's it. And so I've obviously been a fan of all the work the CAC has been doing, and was honored when I was invited to team up a little more closely.
It's interesting path that led you here to the CAC. What are some things you're working on recently or right now?
Well, many folks will be aware that through the CAC, and I've had the privilege of partnering with a number of different guests, Richard, Jacqui, a number of the staff members here, on a podcast series. We've had 2 seasons called Learning How to See. That's been a real delight. The book I had came out most recently is called Faith After Doubt. That came out in January of this year. That's a book that in many ways, another parallel between Richard and me. Richard has talked about first half of life, second half of life, which is kind of a 2-stage way of seeing things. But he's also talked about order, disorder, reorder, which is a kind of 3-stage way of seeing things. And for many years, I've been working with a 4-stage model. They all overlap beautifully, of simplicity, complexity, perplexity, and harmony. So simplicity and complexity being like order, first half of life, perplexity being like that disorder, and harmony being second half of life. And so that book came out in January. And then I just literally sent in my manuscript for my next book, which comes out next May that's called "Do I Stay Christian?"
It's a good question, isn't it?
Well, the book comes from having so many people, including a lot of clergy, who just feel the term has been so debased, and partly as people become more aware of history and they learn the dark sides of Christian history, it's just this deep, deep angst in an awful lot of people. So I wanted to grapple with that in a book, and it's been one of the, you know, I guess writers are always a little bit prejudiced toward their most recent book, but this feels like one of the places where I've gotten down to some things that I've been reaching for, you know, for decades.
For quite some time.
Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that when
Thank you.
that comes out. So from our audience, we have a number of questions here. So Chris asked this: in a culture and time when both the image and concept of Jesus and the word Christian have been so misused, like we were just talking about, especially to cause significant psychological and physical harm,
Yes.
at what point does the identifier, quote, Christian, become more of a barrier to the real change than the term is worth?
Oh my goodness. Well, there it is. That's this issue that I've been grappling with. And was it Chris who asked that question?
Yes, Chris.
So, Chris, what I would kind of want to say to you is first, God bless you for asking the question. Because if we're going to continue to use the word, I think we can only use it ethically, knowing what's behind that question, knowing the damage and harm that has been done and is still being done today and will be being done tomorrow under the auspices of Christianity. And Jesus will be brought in, waved like a flag, almost as a magic incantation to put a kind of holy patina, a holy glow over some unholy, ugly things. You know, for me, if you wanted to say what the top three are, first is that under the name of Christianity and Jesus, we've been plundering the earth for centuries, under quoting verses from Genesis about having dominion over the earth, turning dominion into dictatorship, turning dominion into enslavement. So that whole corruption of Christianity as a credit card to draw on all the wealth of millions of years of creation's, you know, deposits for the benefit of current generations. I mean, and you can just guarantee going forward, you're going to hear Christians opposing responsible care for the earth. Not all Christians, and maybe not even a majority, but a very vocal and well-funded minority. And that's something we have to remember, that money fuels so much of this corruption of Christianity. And then second for me is poverty and economic inequality, you know, and that brings us to this problem of wealth.
Right.
And the sad truth is that just as politicians are bought off by wealthy interests, religious leaders and religious communities can so easily be owned by the power of money. So much more we could say about that. And then third, so it's the planet, poverty, and then the third for me is peace. Peace between races, peace between religions, peace between genders and sexual identities. And you just realize that the Christian faith can become, can play on either side, the side of justice and peace or the side of harm. And so in those and other areas, here's the thing: if we're going to use the word Christian going forward, we're going to have to take a sober, a searching moral inventory of our history and our present. So that's, to me, the challenge. And in the middle of that challenge, some people will decide they just don't want to stay Christian. And I think rather than criticizing them, the rest of us who do feel called to stay Christian, it's just going to be all the more motivation to us to not be afraid and to speak up and to put everything on the table, to say we've got to get back to the core of this thing. In my mind, the example and life of Jesus, our founder and our leader, we've got to get back in sync with that core message. And so that's important work for all of us to do. Maybe the only other thing I'd say now, Tom, besides encouraging people when the book comes out next May, that maybe it'll be helpful for them when I can when I can lay this out in a way that I think honors the journey that people go through, is to say that I'd encourage nobody to shut the door too quickly. In other words, you might need to step out of the house for a while, but you don't need to burn the house down. Or you may decide to stay, but you maybe don't need to say, I'm going to stay and nothing that can happen will ever make me leave. I think we'd all be wise to say the name isn't the important thing, the label isn't the important thing. The reality, the heart, the identity, the purpose, the ethos, the mission, that's the important thing. I'd rather not have the name and be on the path
Right.
than the reverse.
You know, it kind of reminds me of Richard mentioning from time to time that Christianity is just in its infancy in some sense, you know. And also, Cynthia sometimes has been asked, and she said, well, Christianity just hasn't been tried yet.
Yes.
You know, and, this whole concept that I know you're bringing about now with your new book, and also Richard bringing about with Universal Christ, is that Christianity is more expansive than we really think.
Yes.
You want to maybe speak to that just a little bit? Or?
Well, you've just taken a couple of paragraphs right out of my book. Actually, I think those are exactly the kind of issues to bring up. You know, one way this gets asked to me is people say to me, do you really have any hope for Christianity? And when I'm really honest, I say to them, I have a bigger problem than that. There are days when I don't have much hope for humanity, because in a way the problem that Christians have, the problems that Christians have are the problems that human beings have. And Muslims have their version of them, and Jews have their version. And if people want to leave Christianity to find the innocent and pure group to be part of, I think they're going to be disappointed if they stay in that group long enough. Because we humans are, as Jacqui Lewis likes to say, we're a hot mess. But then at that point you realize that if we're going to take the problems of Christianity seriously, we're going to have to take the problems of humanity seriously. And one of the things that will happen through that process, this is my hope, I think one of the plagues of the Christian religion, it's connected to white supremacy and Christian supremacy, because so much of Christian history was in Europe. It's not true now, but white supremacy and Christian supremacy became covers for one another. And this happened through the doctrine of discovery that has had such devastating impacts in the colonial period up till this moment. You put all that together and you just say, as I said before, if we're going to stay Christians, we're going to have to do it with our eyes open. And anyone who wants to put themselves in the category of the innocent could be totally sincere today, and in 10 years, they're going to find out that human problems follow them wherever they go.
Good insights. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
Next question is from an anonymous member of the audience. Asked this. Yesterday you shared that you were finding the words you had used for the divine were feeling limiting to you. I am also exploring holy words. Currently, verbs seem to be working the best for me. For example, abide. Can you share some more thoughts on this topic or words that you are using?
So I'm so glad for that question. And first, I appreciate having sort of the safety to be vulnerable about that. But it really relates to the previous question. I can't talk about this without remembering where I used to live, my previous house. My next door neighbor was Jewish, and one day I was running out of my house to get in my car to drive to a meeting that I was already 5 minutes late for, and she gets my attention and she says, "Hey, Brian, I need to talk to you." And I look at my watch and I say, "I got a couple minutes." And she says, no, this is really urgent. She said, I spent, and you know, she's Jewish. She said, I spent the morning listening to Christian radio. I said, oh, why do you do that? I said, I don't do that. I can't stand to do that. And she said, it wasn't for inspiration. It was for surveillance purposes. And then she said, I'll never forget this. She said, I heard about 5 different preachers say, we're gonna take back this country for Jesus. She got the accent right and everything. And then she said, can you imagine how terrifying that is for a Jewish mother to hear people saying, is she telling me, are they telling me that we better move to Canada? See, and even the word Jesus that's so precious to me, I realize at that moment, every time she hears it, it's a weapon, yeah. And she wonders what kind of world that is going to mean. And, you know, I mean, so many gay people who feel this, you know. And of course, the word has so many racial connotations. I remember the First Nations scholar Waziatawa in Canada said some years ago that she said, I wonder if, you know, the word Christian is even salvageable. So all of these words are problematic. But when it comes to words for God, you know, 2 of the dominant words in the Bible are king and Father for God, and Lord, all of which are words that evoke patriarchy and evoke a dominating power. And when it seems to me so much of the message of Jesus is this message that God, that whoever and whatever God is, it's not a matter of dominating power. And to take Jesus seriously is to say, what does the life and character of Jesus, what does that mean about how we redefine our understanding of God? You know, a great Quaker theologian, Elton Trueblood, said that the doctrine of the deity of Christ is not meant to say that we have a definition of God and we lift Jesus up to it, but to say that we had definitions of God and Jesus came along and we had to adjust them in light of what we saw. So all of that's to say, I feel this for myself, that I'm struggling with this, but I'll tell you, in my own privacy, I can refer to God however I want. It doesn't matter what other people say. And then I need to give myself permission to find those terms. And I'm so interested about that, what was the name of the person?
It was anonymous.
Oh, okay, an anonymous person said that verbs are more helpful. And it's so interesting. That's very much how I feel. Like, I mean, this sounds redundant. I know this doesn't solve problems for anybody, but years ago, I was writing a prayer in my journal, and I prayed, living God of life. Because what strikes me so much is that when I'm speaking to God, it's the vitality of God that I see reflected in us and in this beautiful world and all the rest. And then yesterday when Mirabai was talking about Hildegard von Bingen, and she uses that phrase, living light. So those kinds of words that, they're gerunds, you know, verbals, living, all of that seems to me so powerful.
Yeah, you know, it kind of reminds me of this idea. You know, I know Richard mentions this once in a while. One of the theologians, he said, we should cease using the word God for 50 years.
Yes.
So that, because the concept of God has become, for some, toxic as well.
Well, this is something else I'm writing about in this book that comes out next year. It's like our doctrines are like the tip of the iceberg, and under the surface is 90% more sort of material, assumptions that never make it visible. And many of those assumptions have to do with a dominating power rather than an enlivening and creative power, a dominating power, a threatening power. But it's not just that. Some of our old categories like physics and metaphysics, that there are 2 worlds, a physical world and a spiritual world. I'm finding it harder and harder to live with those categories. If I'm honest to my own life experience. And so all that's to say that we're going to have a challenge individually, but here's where it gets really interesting. Our liturgies preserve the old language. And our liturgies have so much framing in the old language. And I wonder when we're going to get permission. I wonder how big the tear will be where we say, we have people who are they're in such a different world from the liturgies. And what we tend to say is, well, let's update our liturgies the least necessary so we won't upset anybody.
Yeah.
But the gap just gets so great.
Yeah.
And so I think we could be on the verge of what we might call, and maybe this will be someone's calling, and someone will feel the Spirit speaking to them in this. But we need our greatest poets to now say, to say this, here's how we're faithful to our ancestors. Here's how we're faithful to our tradition. Not just to say what they said, but to be as creative in our time as they were in their time, to find the language and the metaphors and the insights in our time that as authentically express our experiences of God as their language and metaphors did in their time. And that to me is one of our challenges now.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Brian, as you talk, I always think of some of the prayers in liturgy like Almighty God, right? And now what would happen if we'd start using terms like, oh, vulnerable God,
Yes.
Or terms that relate to what people go through,
Yes.
In their everyday lives, the difficulties, the hardships and so on, that God relates to that as well, So.
I mean, really, this is so significant. And then, of course, part of what's motivating me, and people will understand this in light of current American politics for the last, not just the last 5 years, but really the last 20 or 30 years, where I think many of us will agree we're seeing a resurgence of authoritarianism. Then I realize that the people for hundreds and hundreds of years who have been very happy to use that kind of language, dominating language for God, had a political interest in it, because if you can keep a divine patriarch, that sort of preserves your human patriarchy too. And a divine dictatorship, that dictatorship's now behind your human dictatorship. So all of those things are alive in the middle of this. So that's, just one other quick example. And I should say, I'm so happy to get to talk about this in a setting like this, because there are a lot of places where I just can't talk about it,
Right.
But I think we're a community where many of us, if we're not struggling with it, we are empathetic to other people who are struggling with it. But years ago, I was a preacher for so many years, and I was preaching through the Gospel of John. And you can, if anyone wants to try this, try reading the Gospel of John, just looking at this issue of domination and images for God. And one thing you see is that by the time you get to the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I'm not using the language of teacher and Lord only anymore. That language, I want to use new language. I'm calling you friends. And that's pretty significant. But then another thing he does, it seems to me, in the Gospel of John especially, in the first few chapters, he just throws images at us. God as wine, God as wind, God as fire. Very dynamic, different kinds of images.
Right, very, in a sense, verbal, movement, almost this whole idea of Trinity, of flow. Of nothing static,
And so different.
Yeah.
And this is one of my problems. I just have to be honest. Even the word God, it feels like a rock. It feels like a thing. And many of you will be aware that one of the revolutions going on, I think, in cutting edge theology is around the idea that if we take evolution seriously, if we just take any basic science seriously, there is nothing in the universe that's static. And if that is supposed to be the artistic expression of God, this is revealing the essential dynamism of whatever it is we mean when we say God. So And I hope this isn't unsettling to people. It's not to criticize anybody. If the word king and almighty and father are the most meaningful terms to you, God bless you. I'm not criticizing you. But you can even understand how in the wrong hands those words could cause some real trouble.
You know, and it just reminds me of one other thing. You know, someone asked the Buddha, what is your concept of God? And he was silent.
Yes.
And then they finally, they said, well, why aren't you expressing what that means? And he said, how can you express or explain the unexplainable?
And this is that beautiful balance that Richard often talks about between the cataphatic and the apophatic. And this is why contemplative silence is so important, and why the way we use our words, you know, maybe this helps us to have always suspicion about our words. Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thanks, Brian. So, Brian, out on the, somewhere in the world, says, I love my church community, but over the last 20 years, I've gradually grown apart from its dominant evangelical view. As I teach and speak there, I ask, how does one remain on the edge of the inside? I find myself with one foot in and one foot out. I would appreciate any of your insights.
Well, first to Brian, you expressed that so beautifully, and I'm so glad you started by saying you love your church community, because if we step out of love, we're in a lot of trouble. The only really dependable, trustworthy thing I can say is, you know, that's a decision that nobody can tell you what to do and when. You're going to have to follow the Spirit's guidance in your own life. But let me offer something that could be useful to some people. And I speak now as someone who is a pastor for 24 years. I remember someone, a man who actually had come to Christian faith as part of our congregation, left the church, and he never came and talked to me, but he told some other people who told me the reason why he left. And you know, this is a long time ago now. Our church had many LGBTQ people in the church, but we hadn't, you know, really crossed the line. And of course, this was long before gay marriage was even a legal possibility in this country. So we hadn't, you know, we hadn't been nearly as public as we became later in our full inclusion of people. But this fellow had come to our church, come to faith, but when he started to realize it wasn't as far along as he thought, he decided to leave. And I remembered at that moment my heart broke. And it did two things to me. His leaving made me say, we're going to lose a lot more good people like him if we don't face this issue. So the first thing I'd like to say, based on that much of the story, is to say, if you do leave, I would encourage you to let the leaders know why you're leaving, and to do it without hate and without insult and without bigotry. You know, if you walk out and say you're a bunch of homophobic jerks, they're not going to say, we're so sorry to see you go. We're going to, you know, they're going to say, well, good riddance for that guy, because he's not nice. So I think it's better to go explaining clearly why you feel you have to leave. But the second thing I'd say is, at that moment when this fellow left, I remember thinking, I wish he had come and told me that he was thinking about leaving. Because what I would have said to him is, I'm with you, I'm on your side, I want us to move forward in this, and if you stay, you can help me, and we can work on this together. So that's the thing. Another thing I'd say, for many people, your next step might be to go to the appropriate leaders in your congregation and say, listen, I want you to know I've been on a journey, and here's where I am now. And I need to know, am I welcome here? Do you want me to be here? Is this a direction? Do you want people like me here? Or would you rather me not be here? And that's going to create a moment of choice for some of those leaders. And there's a lot more we could say about that. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Well, you know, I'm wondering, you know, this whole idea, he mentioned about having one foot in and one foot out, and
Yes.
being on that edge,
Yes,
right, on the
yes.
edge of the inside. And I've often wondered, so many people get to that point, you know, as they go through their path, they get to the point and say, well, I really don't want to abandon my tradition. However, I just don't think I can stay with it anymore.
Yeah.
And how do I navigate that boundary, if you will, if you want to consider it a boundary? And so, you know, I know Richard sometimes talks about, instead of arguing and fighting and just saying, you know, hell with it all and leaving,
Yeah.
and doing it, like you had mentioned, in a way that's with anger, frustration, really doesn't do anybody any good. But what if you could stay with one foot in the tradition and take what's good from that, and then do what you need to do in a better way?
Yes.
You know, so I don't know if
Well,
you can speak to that.
actually, that, you know, that's a really great point. So sometimes if a person wants to stay in a community, they have to say to themselves, I'm part of this community, but I'm not a slave of this community. They don't own every second of my life. So maybe they're not very accepting of LGBTQ persons on Sundays, but listen, from Monday through Saturday, everybody is going to be welcome at my table. And in fact, maybe on Sunday I'll invite some church people over for dinner and some of my other friends over for dinner and let them meet each other.
Yeah.
So we say we're going to live better, you know,
Right,
in our personal lives. But I'll tell you what I think is going on a lot.
Yep.
And I think it's that people see their church or their denomination doing harm, and they just say, every time I show up here, every time I put money in the offering, I feel like I'm complicit in the harm that's happening.
Right.
And that's where, you know, maybe being on the edge of the inside for some people reaches a point where they say, it's just not going to work. And
Right.
and maybe the last thing we can say on this before we move on is to say, one of our great challenges is to say, here's what I feel I'm being led to do. Here's what my conscience requires me to do. But I don't have to judge other people who aren't in the same time zone I am.
Right, right.
And to say they may have some work to do. You know, I was part of the evangelical world, and I was edged out in a very interesting process. And while it was happening, I was reading the work of René Girard, who also has had a big influence, I know, on Richard. And this is a paraphrase, but René Girard offers a definition of a prophet that goes something like this. A prophet is a person who speaks the needed truth to a community in the process of being excluded or executed. In other words, the prophet's days are numbered.
Right,
The prophet's going to be edged out, but there's a period of time, a window of time, where those prophetic words are spoken. And I think that sometimes we need to say, we can't say to everybody, you need to leave now because I'm leaving, but my leaving might change the conditions where now they get to speak a truth that's heard by more people and so on.
Right, right. That's good. And how can we, if we do stay in, how can we start to expand that edge outward to be more inclusive, ever more inclusive, and ever more loving, if you will? So.
Well, and in fact, look, I can speak from experience here. You might leave something and then you start something new. Guess what? You're going to find out how hard it was for the people who you left.
Right.
Because communities are hard, because human beings, we have all of these ugly sides. So maybe the other thing that we should say is, if there is a place that gives room for you and doesn't require you to be complicit and doesn't require you to speak things that you think are harmful, then celebrate that, because there are many places that are trying to open up. You know, just this morning, a few hours ago, I got an email from a pastor who has guided his church through a process of change and transformation. And it hasn't been easy, and they've lost a lot of people, but now new people are coming. And he isn't where if 5 years ago, he isn't where I would wish he would be. But my gosh, where he is now is so much of a better place.
Right.
And I just got an email from him this morning kind of thanking me for friendship and that it's helped him over time for them to get at a better place. And I think we should, that's one of the values of never slamming the door behind you, but always having,
open.
keeping relationships open, yeah.
Beautiful, Brian, thank you. And Brian, thanks for that question. The next question comes from Pat. Can you talk about your path to activism and how you maintain right footing in your work? So often I see people who are activists and they are just angry. They may be trying to do the right thing, but they are working out of anger or hate. What's your approach to this?
Yeah. Well, let's begin first by, thanks for that question. Let's make a distinction between anger and hate. You know, Jim was talking about trauma as being an inability to keep a boundary between yourself and harmful, actors and effects. Yeah. And anger is what helps us. Anger to me, anger is to the soul what pain is to the body. If I put my hand on a hot stove, pain is what makes me pull it away. And if harm is being done to me or someone I love, anger is what makes me say, I'm not going to let this damage continue. Mm-hmm. If I could recommend a book on this, my dear friend, a wonderful Sikh activist, Valerie Kaur, K-A-U-R, wrote a book called See No Stranger. And she has a whole chapter about the necessity of rage, holy rage. She uses a strong word to say, there's a time where we have to stand up. And you know, when you feel that pain in your hand pulls away, it's a strong emotion. And so the anger is really important. And there is so much to be angry about. But, you know, there's that beautiful phrase in the New Testament in Ephesians where Paul says, be angry, but don't sin. And so there it is. You know, I think of a friend of mine, he's an imam, Muslim spiritual leader in Detroit. And we were together once and someone asked him, Imam Dawood, they said, how does your spirituality affect your activism? And he said, as a Muslim, I believe that no one is beyond redemption. And so he said, when I look at the people who are causing harm and injustice, I can never let myself say, that person is a hopeless case. That person is garbage. That person should just be wiped out. He says, I have to remember, God loves that person. That person is not beyond redemption. And I thought, what a beautiful way to get to the heart of the matter. No person is beyond redemption. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't have to stand up to people and I have to oppose people. But to do that without ever saying that person is garbage, I'm going to dehumanize that person. That's a fellow human being. And it's not easy.
Yeah, you know what, it kind of reminds me Brian, sometimes in our dominant culture, so many people see anger as something that is always bad. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet anger sometimes might be the catalyst to actually have people pay attention,
Yeah.
to actually maybe start doing something. But then I think there's that fine edge where anger can become all-consuming.
That's right.
And it can really be, to the person especially that's angry and to the cause, can actually slow the process down or kind of be detrimental to the process. I don't know if you...
Oh, it's a great thing to bring up, and it brings to mind just this morning the daily meditation from CAC was about compassion. And if you think of it this way, if anger is the response to injustice or harm, the flip side of that is someone is being the victim of injustice and harm. It might be me, it might be someone I know and love, it might be the earth itself. At that moment, I can click into compassion for the victim so that my motivation isn't simply now my ego engaged in hostility toward the perpetrator, but I'm also going to be moved by a very powerful emotion, compassion for the victims. And maybe part of our problem is if we only click into anger without the compassion,
Right.
it takes us to a harmful place. So that compassion,
Yeah.
it's like a fragrance to everything we do, and we never forget the compassion. But here's what's so important, I think, in our understanding of the Christian integration of contemplation and action. There are people who think of contemplation as their sort of little personal retreat to bliss and peace of mind. But, and there are certain people who think that any emotion or commitment is taking them out of the place of perfect peace and contemplation.
Right.
But anger, compassion, and other emotions are what put us into motion. Motion is what puts us into action. And I think it's a danger that I'm so glad that we're aware of and not slip into, of people pursuing contemplation as an escape from emotion, and even emotions that disturb us. Well, of course they disturb us because they're going to move us to action.
Right. It's the part of being human. Those emotions, like you said, move us to action. Without them, what would we be? We'd be machines, right? And we're not.
That's right.
And that, the whole idea, the reason that Richard established the center 33 years ago was because there were so many people that were activists that weren't grounded in something deeper, like some type of contemplative practice or contemplation, and they just, it burnt out. So there's the word "and" in there.
That "and" is so key. The question asked something about how I got involved in activism, and there's so many stories I could tell, but let me just say, the reason I got involved in activism is because I was invited. Somebody asked me. Somebody cared, and they asked me to care. I mean, I could go way, way back to, in some ways, my first activism was taking in refugees. And back then it was refugees from Cambodia and Vietnam and Laos. I got a call from a woman who worked in a refugee resettlement agency. And she said, "Brian, I hate to do this to you." And I hadn't worked with her before, but we'd met somewhere. She calls me and says, "I have a Cambodian family coming in on a plane at 11 o'clock tonight, and their sponsors backed out." She says, "I already have like 4 families living in my apartment. I can't take in anybody else. Is there any way you could take them in?" And so that's how I got involved. Someone asked me.
Yeah.
And some years, I live in Southwest Florida now, and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is one of the most wonderful organizations I've ever been connected to. And they invited me to get involved in their work to help farm workers, to work with farm workers to improve their lives and conditions. And I remember, this is my honest feeling, when I'm around these folks, I often feel I'm around some of the best Christians I've ever met. Now, a lot of them haven't finished high school, they don't have any theological training, but what I've learned from them is that in their almost all Catholic background, they were taught by liberation theologians who taught them deep in their bones that God is the God of justice and God is the God of the poor. And when I'm with them, I don't feel anger and I don't feel hatred. I feel unshakable resolve that says, we know that God is on the side of justice. We know God is on the side of compassion. We know what's being done to us right now is injustice. And so we're bold, and it's almost like we know we're going to win. And so, because God is with us. And what's interesting is it makes them courageous and fierce. And, I've been part of die-ins and pray-ins and all kinds of public actions that are confrontational. But because they have this confidence, it's not like my ego and my hatred and my anger is necessary. It's my presence with the strength of God in me is going to make a difference.
You bring up something so interesting, I think, because I hear it from so many people. So many times people say, I want to get involved, but I'm just not sure how to get involved. And see, the person that invited you must have seen something in you that they knew that maybe you wouldn't say no, or they knew that, that you had something that you had to offer. And so I'm wondering if people who might have friends they know and they might want to take some action, it might be just as simple as an ask.
That's right.
The worst they could say is no, right?
That's so true.
So,
So true. And listen, if you start paying attention, in fact, I'd encourage you, this is where you are, I dare you to pray and say, show me where I can get involved first. Next, where's my next opportunity? Keep my eyes open for my next opportunity. And that's a pretty exciting adventure.
yeah, and I think there's so much to that, this whole idea of everything is connected, right? And so if we can sit and pray or sit in contemplation and become more open, if you will, to what needs to be done, you're going to find synchronicities happen that you might have not known before. I hear it from people time after time after time as they commit to some form of prayer and practice.
As soon as you say that, I'm just going back in my life, and I'm remembering when my children were young. And when you have young children, it's about all the action you can take care of. We had 4 children in 6 years, so we had a lot of diapers and all the rest. And one of my children was going through cancer treatment, and it was a very busy time in our lives. But while this was going on, I remember realizing I was involved with all kinds of clergy groups. I was a young pastor. All of them were white. And I said, God, this isn't right. I need to break out into some new circles of friends. Well, a few days, literally, I started praying about that. It's like it bothered me. I don't like being in these all white circles,
Right.
And I want to say it's not like I was doing something wrong. Things were set up that way. Everything was, set up that way. So now I say, I've got to do something about it. So I just prayed. A few days later, one of my son's elementary school had a father-son pancake breakfast. And so I show up at the pancake breakfast, and one of my son's classmates, young African-American boy, they're talking, and I met his father. So we sat together at the breakfast, and talk about a synchronicity. His father was a Pentecostal pastor, the storefront church Pentecostal pastor. And I said, hey, we're having breakfast here today. Let's get together again. Let's go out for breakfast or lunch. We met, and here's what he said to me. He said, I'm so glad you invited me to lunch. He said, my wife left me a few months ago, and we're going to get divorced. And my denomination will defrock me because I'm divorced. And he said, I don't have anyone I can talk to. And as you can imagine, a deep bond, grew between us. And it was a rich, beautiful friendship. He invited me to preach in his church, and I got him involved in a number. I brought him to a pastor's group that was all these white pastors. And we were all in the neighborhood, so he got involved. He said to me later, I have never had a white friend in my life.
Wow.
And I've never been involved to a meeting of pastors outside of my, own background. So it's funny, I just prayed and the synchronicity happened. I'm sure I could have how many I'd missed before that, opportunities. But
it seems like that if we can get the ego in check, if you will, enough to all the possibilities that are happening around us, the synchronicities, we all of a sudden, like, it happens, so it's so interesting. So thanks for your response, Brian. And Pat, thank you for your question. Next question comes from Angela. She asks, I know that you have spoken about your children in other settings. How can you help us to navigate community friends, family and friends around LGBTQIA+ issues? We are struggling with the people who we love who cannot love our gay children in full. We aren't willing to compromise.
Well, first, God bless you for not being willing to compromise. I think of the words of an African theologian from Congo named Mabiala Kenzo, who really was a mentor to me. And I'll never forget, he said to me one phrase that will be with me the rest of my life. He said, we need the courage to differ graciously. And he was saying this, for me as an African theologian, I need to be able to go to my white Christian colleagues and I have to have the courage to differ graciously with them. Otherwise, they'll dominate and, silence my voice. I need the courage to differ graciously. But then he said, and you white Christians, you need the courage to differ graciously with your fellow white Christians who are silencing us. So that phrase has stayed with me, and I think it applies in many situations. And one of the things I think it might mean in family systems is for when some member of your family speaks ill of LGBTQ persons, for you to then say, hey, listen, just a minute. And I often find it really helps if my body language comes in here. Hey, just a minute. I need you to know, I don't see it that way. And I find what you just said, it hurts me because of people I love. I just need you to know that. And then you just let it sit. And sometimes it's almost like, an orchestra conductor. You let the moment sit to let it settle. What you just said hurts me. I'm saying I can't let it go unaddressed, and I'm gonna let the discomfort hang in the air for a couple minutes.
Right.
And then you see what happens. But hey, I just need you to know what you just said breaks my heart because of people I love and people who are close to me. And in this case, my own children.
Yeah, and my son as well, so yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then I think what that means sometimes is we say, hey, listen, I just need you to know if my kids aren't welcome, I'm not welcome either. So if you don't want them at Thanksgiving dinner, you don't want me either. I'd love to be there, but we're connected, and they're rejected, I'm rejected. And that is difficult, and you don't, but my African friend, Kenzo, said it so well. It's courage to differ graciously. There's no hate, and it's with a broken heart, and it hurts. But that pain, see, here's the thing. We talked about anger and emotion. The pain of that moment, you're not trying to hurt anyone. You're acknowledging that you've been hurt. But you let it be there, and the discomfort is what's going to help destabilize the systems. And that's one of the necessary parts of change happening.
Yeah, and it's, I think at this time, more and more awareness is coming about, and even Pope Francis, with the words, "Who am I to judge?"
Yes.
But it is difficult. I know in my family, as well, and a lot of families as well, when this comes up, and like you said, it's so important, I think, to let people know that I don't agree with it. It's not right what you're saying, and do it in a way that is loving as can be, and yet it's going to be uncomfortable for them, which it should be.
Yeah.
So. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Angela, for that question. Next, Tania asked, you mentioned climate crisis. It's hard because we need to pay attention to injustices in front of us now, but yes, climate change puts all humans in peril, and we know marginalized and economically disadvantaged people will be hit first. It's overwhelming. Can you say more on how we approach this subject?
Sure. Well, look, first, I'm really glad that that this question doesn't create an either-or tension. Some of us right now, we have to be all in on Black Lives Matter, and some of us right now, we have to be all in on making sure Haitian refugees are not treated like refuse. Right now, some of us have to be all in on free and fair elections, and not having elections and democracy overturned. Different ones of us have to be all in, but we have to remember that it's all part of one story: greater justice, greater compassion, greater, well, as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, may God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. May God's dreams come true for earth as in heaven. So they're all part of one big dream of a better world. But the fact is, climate change is not a separate issue. It's a part of every other issue. It will make every other issue worse as it exacerbates. And it will actually, if we address the causes of climate change, it could make every other issue better. So all of these things are interrelated, and it helps us then to say, listen, I'm all in on this issue. I don't have too much time left over for that issue, but I'm really glad you're all in on that issue, and let's be supportive of each other. To me, wouldn't that be wonderful if our churches or faith communities were getting together and I'm finding out how's it going on your issue, and you're interested, how's it going on my issue, and we understand how we're all involved in the big picture of God's love and care for this world. But here's what I'd say on climate change. If you don't have basic education, this is a great time to get basic education. And there are many great organizations doing this. Faith and Interfaith Power and Light is a wonderful Christian organization, and multi-faith organization grappling with this. Eco America is an organization, I serve on their advisory board, and they have a special division for Christians called, and other people of faith, called Blessed Tomorrow. Great organizations. But I just say first, really get educated. And then you'll find out that there are a whole lot of things you can do in your life and in your home. All of those things are important, and I would encourage you to do them. It was one of the happiest days in my economic life when I got my first hybrid vehicle, and when I got solar panels on my house. All that's important. But at the end of the day, the most important thing any of us can do, we should do all those things, but they give us a commitment to vote. And we've got to vote for candidates who take this seriously. And then we've got to push those candidates. And that maybe brings us sort of full circle to say, you know, this isn't just we do something and then we go back to complacency. But this is what a life of contemplation and action is. It's all integrated, and we're never finished.
That's beautiful, Brian. Well, this has been really a joy being with you here today, and having you respond to a lot of the questions that are really on people's minds today. I know that recently you did your podcast, Learning How to See, and one of the some of the folks out there, Rod for one, asked about it. Can you maybe just say briefly just a little bit about that before we close today?
Sure. Well, there are 2 seasons, and the first season we lay out the idea of biases that keep us from seeing, and in the second season we actually engage in some spiritual practices to help us address those biases in ourselves, because as in many things, we need to address our own eye, the boards in our own eye, before we try to fix up other people.
Perfect. CAC.org, and look under podcast for that. And Bren, thank you so much for taking the time today, and so much to offer. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.